Alrighty, good on there.
See you too.
And now Facebook. Alrighty, looks like we're good to go.
Good to go.
Maybe. YouTube does this weird thing where Facebook does this weird thing where it puts us on for like 20 seconds, then kicks us off and puts us back on. I couldn't quite tell you why it does that. So every time I get done with a stream, it has 2 videos. Yeah, if you look on there right now, you'll see there's 2 videos. Yeah. I don't understand it. That's okay. That's okay. Videos. All right, there we go. So hopefully somebody's on there somewhere, and all right, I think we're good to go. Good afternoon or maybe evening to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us today on this edition of Walking Through History. My name is Nick Angel, and above me on the screen, or I guess beside me on the screen, depends on how you're seeing it on Facebook or YouTube, is my good friend Alan Sinastrang. Alan, good afternoon to you, sir. Hope that you've had a good
man. Day. Ready to get going, ready to get out of here.
Right. Yeah, we got a lot to go through today. We're going to begin in Exodus chapter 11 as we're looking at the 10th and final plague that God brings against Egypt, and how this will be the precipice for Pharaoh and Egypt very, let's say, hurriedly sending the Israelites out of their land. We're beginning in Exodus chapter 11 and verse 1. If you'd like to join us there, Exodus chapter 11 and verse number 1. The text says that the Lord said to Moses, I will bring one more plague on Pharaoh and on Egypt. After that, he will let you go from here. And when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here. Now announce to the people that both men and women should ask their neighbors for silver and gold items. And the Lord gave the people favor with the Egyptians. In addition, Moses himself was very regarded in the land of Egypt by Pharaoh's officials and the people. So Moses said, this is what the Lord says. About midnight, I will go throughout Egypt, and every firstborn male in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne, the firstborn of the servant girl who is at the grindstones, as well as every firstborn of the livestock. Then there will be a great cry of anguish throughout all the land of Egypt, such as never was before or ever will be again. But against all the Israelites, whether people or animals, not even a dog will snarl, so that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel. All these officials of yours will come down to me and bow before me, saying, get out, you and all the people who follow you. After that, I will get out. And he went out from Pharaoh's presence, fiercely angry. And the Lord said to Moses in Exodus chapter 11 and verse 9, Pharaoh will not listen to you, so that my wonders may be multiplied in the land of Egypt. Moses and Aaron did all these wonders before Pharaoh, but the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and he would not let the Israelites go out of his land. This text follows the previous 3 chapters, which detail, I guess 3.5 actually, that detail the plagues against Egypt. This is the 10th and final plague that the Lord brings against Egypt. And here, what we really have in chapter 11 is a summation of what's going to take place over the next chapter. In chapter 12. Chapter 12 is a rather long chapter, about 50 some verses, but what we have here in chapter 11 is a great summation of what's going to take place. And now, one of the things I noticed as I read through this text is that there is kind of a repetitive nature, a cycle almost, that comes up from this chapter into chapter 12. Here in chapter 11, there's the words from the Lord of what's going to happen. If we skip over chapter 12, we see again in chapter 12 through 13 what's going to happen very shortly here in Egypt. Then there is some writing concerning the Passover that would take place ceremoniously and as a ritual for the rest of Israel's history. And then we get back to what's actually about to take place in verse 29. And then once you know it again, it kind of comes back into play again, beginning in chapter 12 and verse 43. Alan, what do you think of just the way that the Lord inspired Moses to write this text in this way? Why the cyclical type of structure? Why not just get into it and keep the story going?
Couple possible answers. I mean, again, we can't think of these books as just like novels all the time. So they are collections. They are. I mean, it's not just, Moses sat down and wrote out the entire story, from Genesis 1 to whatever the end of Deuteronomy is. I mean, there's a process that these go through. So there are some. I would think, there's some editing going on, additions, adding in just important kind of sidebars, important footnotes here that go in this area of the narrative. So I think that's why we have kind of a back and forth going with chapter 12, talking about the specifics of the Passover, then getting back to the narrative section and back and forth here. But clearly, I mean, this is the biggest, the most screen time, I guess you would say, is spent on this final plague. And notice how much goes into the just the descriptions of the rules and the law and what the Israelites should be doing and why, so they can tell this to their sons and grandsons, and this can pass on through the generations. So this is clearly the moment that they are to remember, and they will associate it with the actual Exodus too. But I think it's this really this final plague is, I think, the focal point of what they are supposed to remember when they do celebrate the Passover, because of how much just this Passover is really focused on. The actual Exodus from Egypt is kind of a shorter section.
Yes.
And we tend to, I mean, obviously the book is called Exodus, so we tend to think of that as the pivotal moment, which in a way it is. But I really think this Passover, just in a theological, big picture sense, I mean, this is the pinnacle of the Old Testament right here, because of how much how much goes back to how much later on comes back, points back to this Passover. And of course, when we start to see all the parallels with Christ as well, just how important this event was in their history.
Right. I think one of the key aspects of this passage and this text is what we see in verse number 7 here of chapter 11. Against all the Israelites, whether people or animal, not even a dog will snarl, so that you may know. How many times, Alan, have we seen that type of phraseology in Exodus? So you may know, or so the Egyptians may know, so the whole world. If we go back to chapter 9 and verse number 16, however, I have let you live for this purpose, to show you my power, to make my name known on the whole earth. You are still acting arrogantly against my people, not letting them go. This is the Lord speaking to Pharaoh. It's not just to let them know, not just let the whole world know, but it is also to let the Israelites know that they were a special people. What you mentioned about this being a day that was to live on in infamy, that was supposed to be a very special day. There's another word I'm thinking of, I can't get out of my head right now, but a monumental day, there we go, in the history of this people. This was the day in which this people came out. I really like the way Alistair Roberts talks about this text. He talks about this being the birth story. This is the birth story of Israel, that they are coming out of Egypt. They are being birthed out of Egypt, and God has now delivered them in this birthing process, and they've gone through birth pains with the mistreatment here in Egypt, and now with this delivery process, that this is the birth of a nation. And we see that here within this text, this distinction, this deliverance that's being brought up here in Exodus chapter 11, 12, and then portions of 13.
That idea of this nation being born right now. I mean, they've been a mass of people, but they really haven't come together as a nation. at this point. So this is kind of a birth story, and that really is a great parallel to the 10th plague, because
Yes,
there's
it is.
and another big thing we'll talk about as we go here is this idea of substitution,
Mm-hmm.
and that's what the Passover is brings to the biblical narrative, is this
Right.
concept of substitutionary sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
We've seen sacrifices throughout Genesis so far, but it's never been explicitly talked about as being a substitutionary
Right.
sacrifice. It's just been more of a worship sacrifice. Well, you know, we know as the story continues and as we learn about the law of Moses and the law that God gives on Mount Sinai, that a big portion of those sacrifices was to be a substitute for ourselves
The
or
atonement.
the people, the atonement. Yeah, the idea of atonement
Factor, right.
So this is,
Absolutely.
and what is atonement? It's one life in the place of another,
Mm-hmm.
and that's we see that in the whole old law. It was the life of an animal
Right.
for taking the place of the life of the person who had sinned.
Mm-hmm.
And his sin, and we know that sin brings death, or the penalty for our sin is death.
Right.
So there needs to, if we are not going to pay the penalty, then something or someone else has to atone, has to be the substitute for that.
Right.
So you see here that this birth of a nation is coming, and at the expense of the firstborn of Egypt.
Mm-hmm.
And of course the Passover lamb will be a substitute, and will be the necessary blood, the necessary death in the place of the people of Israel. And of course, the book of Hebrews,
Mm-hmm.
Paul, John, all the New Testament apostles clearly talk about Jesus as that final perfect substitute. He is our Passover lamb.
Right.
He is the one that took our place, and took God's wrath instead of, what we deserve. So again, all of that is happening right here in these three chapters, and it's just one of the pivotal moments in the Bible.
Yeah, there is so much significance that is found here in these 3 chapters, or I guess 2.5 chapters, 11, 12, and portions of 13. And the significance is not just kept here in the Exodus story. As you mentioned, it is Bible wide, and there's so many different places that tie into this text. As you talk about the Passover lamb, and we think about Hebrews, that without the shedding of blood there is no forgiveness of sins. We go to Leviticus 17 verse 11, that the life is in the blood, and it shall be given on the altar as atonement for your sins. Even thinking about what's going on here within this story, thinking about the sin of Egypt striking down the children of, or the sons of Israel. If we go back in the text, we can see where the Lord refers to Israel as his firstborn son. Well, for that sin of striking down the sons of his son, what does the Lord do in this moment? He strikes down the sons, the firstborn sons of those who are in Egypt. Again, he rectifies that situation. That brings in into play here that just the character of God, that there is so much of the character of God that is learned here within the Exodus story. There's his love that he has for his people, that they cry out for God, and they cry out to him based upon their mistreatment in Egypt, that they are hurting, they are broken, and they cry out to God for deliverance. His love is seen in sending this deliverer. But then we also see his justice here, that God is bringing justice against Egypt for their sins. Again, the killing of the first of the sons of Israel. We see here the arrogance of Pharaoh being judged here, the arrogance of the Egyptian gods, and thinking that they could show themselves as having power against God, and trying to replicate the signs that were done with the snake, and then the first 2 plagues, the blood and the frogs. We see judgment coming down here. But then on the flip side, what we see is grace and mercy on behalf of God towards the Israelites. That grace and mercy, and giving them the opportunity to be spared from this angel of death, you might call it, this destroyer who is coming. I believe that's the Lord there, who's coming to take the lives of the Egyptians who were standing against Israel. So there's just so much here, so very much that plays as a foundation for principles that are going to carry on throughout the rest of Scripture. As you mentioned, the atonement we see here, God's grace and mercy are seen here. Ultimately, so much of this is fulfilled in Jesus. I think Isaiah 53, or at the end of 52, those first few verses of chapter 52 of Isaiah going into Isaiah 53, they find their foundation here within this text, and they're carried forward as John proclaims in John 1 and verse 29, behold, the Lamb of God who comes to take away the sins of the world. There's just so much here. And it would take a long time for us to really unpack everything to its fullest extent. But I hope that what we share with you this afternoon might whet your appetite a little bit to go in and do some more digging and explore the text a little more here.
You mentioned the grace and mercy. I want to highlight real quick, because a lot of skeptics of the Bible will look at this and they'll see a lot of times God will use plagues, and yes, people will die, but rarely does he actually strike himself the people in that sense. It's almost a roundabout way, but clearly here he is striking, and these are the firstborn of Egypt. I mean, these are children, babies sometimes. That's a tough concept for obviously critics of the Bible to wrap their mind around. Mm-hmm. But
and understandably so.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Let's be sympathetic. Understandably so. This God who is defined as love. God is love. How could he do something such as this?
But you have to, if you just look at that, then yeah, that seems bad. But when you look at what has happened up till now, and I love chapter 11 and verse 8, chapter 11 and verse 8, when Moses leaves the presence of Pharaoh, he is fiercely angry. Why is that? Think about what Moses has done over, I think this is several months since the first, probably I think from like August, and then we're talking about March is when this Exodus and the final thing happened. So we're talking about several months of plagues against Egypt. What were those? Those were signs. Those were wonders. Those were supposed to convince Pharaoh to let them go, let them all go. And time again, Pharaoh hardened his heart and he would not let them go. And it didn't have to come to this. We see all these as, oh, God, just this evil God that, strikes plagues. Well, what was he doing? He was starting easy. He was trying to warn them, like, let my people go. You have to listen to me. Pharaoh, you have to humble yourself. Mm-hmm. Please do that. I mean, what were those signs and wonders but to convince him? And he's still obstinate. So, I would love to get 10 chances to obey God, 10 or more chances. I hope if there's ever something that I need to do, I get that many opportunities. But if I turn away, if I harden my heart 10 or more times, clear signs that I need to obey God, and I disobey, I mean, what other excuse do I have at this point? And what else could God do? Really? What other signs can he do that will convince him to humble himself and change his heart? And even then, that still doesn't happen. So even after Pharaoh lets him go, he still chases. He changes his mind again and chases after him. So I love that Moses is so angry. He's fiercely angry. We tend to see Moses as this kind of meek figure at this point, but that anger kind of flares back up again sometimes throughout the wilderness wanderings as well. And he's angry and he's righteously angry because it did not have to come to this. God was more than graceful and merciful enough. And this is, when you look at it that way, this is not on God. This is all on Pharaoh and the Egyptians for their obstinance. I mean, they have no one to blame but themselves for this final plague.
Absolutely. Yeah. Just looking at this text, Moses comes, and this is the final time that Moses comes to Pharaoh, I believe. Maybe it's no. Well, of course, there's a time whenever they come back, he summons them to send them away. But he lets them know, up to the point he lets them know this is what's going to happen. And Pharaoh has the chance here. I think right here at this moment, he could have said, okay, that's enough. That's too much, because it is explicit here that Moses says these things, that the firstborn of Pharaoh is going to die. And yet we don't see Pharaoh. We don't really see him giving any sort of consideration, which to me is incredible considering what has happened up until this point. I mean, did he really not think God could do this? If he has done all these other plagues, if he has been behind everything else up until this point, why not this too? Yet Pharaoh doesn't relent at all. Whenever we get into chapter 12, the Lord gets into the way that the Israelites would be protected, and the way the Hebrews would be protected. Michael Heiser makes a point here concerning the Passover, and he makes the argument that this word Passover isn't necessarily the most accurate meaning for what is taking place here in the Hebrew text. He makes the argument that the term Passover and that concept of Passover actually comes more so from the Latin Vulgate version of the Old Testament. And so his argument then is that that's not necessarily a bad understanding, but a better understanding here would be this is a protection. This is a hedge of protection, you might say, the way we sometimes pray, that was given to the Israelites, that they would be protected from doing what is going to be seen here in chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, that the Lord says to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month is to be the beginning of months for you. It is the first month of your year. Tell the community, here's the main part. Here's the protection part that's going to play a part in the future. Is going to set the precedent for a following tradition to be held. Verse number 3, tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, they must each select an animal of the flock according to their father's families, one animal per family. But if the household is too small for a whole animal, that person and the neighbor nearest his house are to select one based on the combined number of people. You should apportion the animal according to what each will eat. You must have an unblemished animal, a 1-year-old male. You may take it from either the sheep or the goats. You are to keep it until the 14th day of the month, and then the whole assembly of the community of Israel will slaughter the animals at twilight. They must take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts and the lintel of the house where they eat them. They are to eat the meat that night. They should eat it roasted over a fire along with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. I approve of that. Definitely like the roasted more than what he says that you're not supposed to do, which is do not eat any of it raw. Of course not. Or cooked in boiling water. No, I definitely like roasted better myself. But roasted over the fire, its head as well as its legs and inner organs. You must not leave any of it until morning. Any part of it left until morning you must burn, and here is how you must eat it. You must be dressed for travel. So remember, this is the current situation they're to be participating in. This is whenever they do it right now. Well, here's the practical portion. You need to be dressed for travel, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You are to eat it in a hurry. It is the Lord's Passover. Well, why do they need it? And why do they need to eat it in a hurry? Because what's going to happen is going to lead to them being expelled from Egypt. Verse 12, I'll pass through the land of Egypt on that night and strike every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both people and the animals. I am the Lord. I will execute judgment against all the gods of Egypt. That blood on the house where you are staying will be a distinguishing mark for you. It's going to be that protective mark for you. And remember, what did the Lord say back in chapter 11 and verse number 8? I will make a distinction between the Egyptians and you. Here is that portion. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. No plague will be among you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. And Alan, if we skipped over to verse number 29, we would see this story, this what the Lord is telling them to do. We see that coming into play, that at midnight in verse 29, at midnight, the Lord struck every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, every firstborn of the livestock. And during the night, Pharaoh got up, he along with all of his officials and all the Egyptians. And there was a loud wailing throughout Egypt because there wasn't a house without someone dead. What promises has the Lord made up to this point, Alan, that have not come to pass? Everything that he says is going to happen has come to happen. Pharaoh has no excuse.
It's real interesting. I look down at 32 is a really interesting verse. This is Pharaoh right at the end. Take even your flocks and your herds as you asked and leave, and also bless me.
Yep.
kind of a strange thing. Like, why? I mean, why would? Well, what does he mean by that? Does he mean, hey, if you are gone, that is a blessing to me? That would be true. For the Israelites to be gone would be a blessing to him. But one thing I like to notice is who usually does the blessing in Scripture so far in Genesis or in Exodus. It's always the greater that blesses the lesser. So you have Melchizedek blessing Abraham, Abraham blessing Isaac, Isaac blessing Jacob, Jacob blessing his sons, God blessing everybody because God's obviously number one.
Right.
But here, this is Pharaoh asking for a blessing from, I would assume, from Moses, and in a sense, in a way, God here. So you finally have a moment of of, I guess, a little bit of clarity, even if whether he meant to say this or not, but he finally acknowledges that, I, Pharaoh, am not the number one. I cannot bless, I'm not the one that gives the blessing. It is God who blesses. He is ahead. He is before me. He is above me. So just kind of an interesting, and yet, I mean, clearly I think these are just words, not dripping with extra meaning. We
Right.
can just see the irony in these words because he still is obstinate later on. But
But
I
he said something similar to this a number of times after a plague. Like I think of chapter 8 and verse 28. Pharaoh responded, "This is following the let's see here. This is following the flies. I will let you go." This Pharaoh responded, "I will let you go and sacrifice the Lord your God in the wilderness, but don't go very far. Make an appeal for me." There's always, from Pharaoh's standpoint, there's always got to be something in it for him,
Mhm.
and that, I think that's a consistent thing that we see throughout this text. But I like what you're talking about here. Also, bless me, that concept of the greater blessing, the lesser. I do wonder if Pharaoh at this moment has realized that he's really met his match. And just real quick, Alan, before you hop back in, I want to think about what's going on here with this particular plague, specifically. Though this has been true of the entirety of the plagues, 1 through 9, though those have been attacks not just on Pharaoh and the people, but on the gods of Egypt. This one particular plague really solidified an attack on Pharaoh as deity, Pharaoh as God. In the process of moving from Pharaoh to Pharaoh, so once a Pharaoh died within Egypt, that was a very serious time for the Egyptians because they recognized that there had to be the rising up this new deity incarnate, Horus incarnate, needed to be raised up, and the firstborn son of Pharaoh was groomed for that. He was already seen in a sense as a god. Well, what happens here? Here is the God of Israel literally striking down who they perceive to be a god, throwing completely off the balance of the supernatural within Egypt. This, more than any of the other plagues, was one that really hit them hard from a religious standpoint. And Pharaoh here, I can just see him as a broken man. In this moment, at least, in this real moment, in the moment, he is broken. I think he sees himself as defeated. He knows that this God is greater than anything he has ever faced and ever will face. And all he can say is, "Bless me." That's all I can ask for.
Another thing I noticed throughout 12 and 13 is as God is talking about these commands and talking about these statutes and things that they are supposed to remember. That idea of remembering, or this is chapter 12, 24, keep this command permanently as a statute for you and your descendants. Chapter 12, verse 14, this day is a memorial for you. And even right at the beginning of chapter 12, what does God do with this holiday, basically, this Passover? He completely changes their calendar
Mm-hmm.
to make this their first month. So whatever, I mean, they clearly had some sort of calendar before. That's been changed now with this introduction of this Passover, and what does that do? I mean, obviously, having a special day. I mean, they're supposed to remember this. We have holidays like that now. And even I think it's interesting. We do the same thing with Christ. I mean, what year is it? It's 2020. Well, what was year zero or year one? That was supposed to be about when Christ was born. So even in our own calendar, we remember that most pivotal of events in human history. Well, here they are changing their customs, their calendar, their memorial schedule to remember this event, because it really is their birth, their beginning, the beginning of their nation right here, and it's just it makes it so sad, the emphasis on remembering this event, the Passover. It makes it so sad later on in the books of Kings and Chronicles when you get to kings like Hezekiah or kings like Josiah, and it takes these great moral kings that come in, and what have they done? They've neglected the Passover. They have not remembered. So goodness knows. I mean, it could have been 50 years, 100 years since their last Passover. So they completely forget their origins, their birth. And I mean, and how dangerous was that for them? I mean, that would be the equivalent if we just started, okay, instead of year 2020, it's year one again, the year of the coronavirus, we're starting over again, and then we slowly forget about Christ, or in a similar way. But so I just thought it striking how many times it's mentioned to remember and why they are doing this as a memorial for not just them, but for their children.
Yeah, I think it just shows a common human weakness that we have. We are unfortunately very forgetful. We are. We are extremely forgetful people. It is not uncommon for us to have something good done for us, and how quickly we forget that, and we fail to show appreciation for something good that has been done to us. But you're speaking about what's going to happen down the road, Alan, in the middle of this narrative, right? So we have the narrative portion being given from verses 12 through 13. And then there's this break from verses 14 through 28. And then it picks up again the story in verse number 29. Well, what's happening here in verse 14? What we read are these further instructions, not for this specific event, this Passover, this inaugural Passover, but what they're going to do down the road. We read beginning in verse number 14 of Exodus chapter 12 that this day is to be a memorial for you, and you must celebrate it as a festival to the Lord. You are to celebrate it throughout your generations as a permanent statute. That phrase there is mentioned, I think, at least 3 times in the text. A permanent statute. You must eat unleavened bread for 7 days. On the first day, you must remove yeast from your houses. Whoever eats what is leavened from the first day through the 7th day must be cut off from Israel. You are to hold a sacred assembly on the first day and another sacred assembly on the 7th day. No work may be done on those days except for preparing what people need to eat. You may do only that. You are to observe the festival of unleavened bread because of this very day I brought your military divisions out of Egypt. I think that's key here to recognize in the text. There's emphasis here on the military divisions. You must observe this day throughout your generations as a permanent statute. You are to eat unleavened bread in the first month, from the evening of the 14th day of the month until the evening of the 21st day. Yeast must not be found in your houses for 7 days. And if anyone eats anything leavened, that person, whether a resident alien or native of the land, must be cut off from the community of Israel. Do not eat anything leavened. Eat unleavened bread in all your homes. Then Moses summoned all the elders of Israel and said to them, go, select an animal from the flock according to your families and slaughter the Passover animal. Take the cluster of hyssop, dip it in the blood, that is the basin, and brush the lintel and the 2 doorposts with some of the blood in the basin. None of you may go out the door of his house until morning. When the Lord passes through to strike and see the blood on the lintel and the 2 doorposts, he will pass over the door and not let the destroyer enter your homes to strike you. Notice here again, so we have this bouncing back and forth, as we mentioned earlier. It's what's currently going on, what you're going to do, what's currently going on, and now notice again verse 24, what you're going to do. Keep this commandment permanently as a statute for you and your descendants when you enter the land that the Lord will give you as he promised. You are to observe this ceremony. And when your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? You are to reply, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, for he has passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and spared our homes. So the people knelt low and worshiped. And the Israelites went and did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. Alan, what do you see here as significant from this significant event moving forward later on in their history? You just talked about the sadness of them forgetting, but what is actually going on here in this that is of significance for them that their children might even ask, well, why are you doing this?
Well, I mean, you think about, I guess the unleavened bread is kind of the first one for me, because that would be unusual. I mean, why would you unleaven the bread? Why would you just put some leaven in it, make a nice big loaf or whatever? So that would really, if you didn't know the story and the why, that would be strange. But when you know the why, that they're going to be leaving soon, they need flat bread to be able to carry it better.
So Alan, maybe for those who are watching who don't understand the concept of leavened to unleavened bread, leavened bread would be like what we buy in the store, the fluffy bread. But an unleavened piece of bread, think more of like a tortilla type of bread product. So that rising process takes time. Mm-hmm. So very practically here, they don't have time to let the bread rise. Therefore, they have the unleavened bread, which is able to be cooked faster. It's able to be carried easier just because it plainly doesn't take up as much space. So there's a very practical thing here. But even this particular type of idea is seen in the New Testament. It's used in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, talking about the leaven, take the unleavened or take the leaven out of the lump so that it doesn't ruin the whole lump. So again, there's so many things rooted here within this text.
Mm-hmm. And then of course, verse 28 is a good contrast to Pharaoh earlier.
Mm-hmm. That's good.
Right before that, the people knelt low and worshiped, and the Israelites went and did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. So that is the proper response to when God gives a command, as opposed to, the no's that Pharaoh consistently gives to Moses and Aaron when they deliver a message from the Lord.
Yeah, I want to bring up something else that Alistair Roberts mentioned in this particular section. What we see in, let's see here, beginning of verse 21, that you're selecting an animal from the flock, that you're taking a cluster of hyssop, you're dipping blood, and this is the blood of the goats. Again, we're thinking about this being a birthing process. Well, where is the conception of this story, Alan? The conception of the Israelites finding themselves in Egypt. When does that happen?
Back in Joseph's day.
Joseph, right?
Yeah.
So think about the parallels. I never noticed this. I'm glad Alistair brought this to my attention. I don't know if you're able to listen to his section on this or not, but he draws a number of parallels between what happens in Joseph's story whenever he is kidnapped and sent down to Egypt and what is found here at the exiting of Egypt. So number one, there was a choice lamb. Well, who's the choice lamb in the family of Jacob? It was Joseph. Then we have here the dipping of blood. Well, when was there dipping of blood in Joseph's story? Whenever they took his tunic, dipped it in blood. Oh, by the way, what type of blood was that? I believe it was goat blood. And what do we see here? You can use either a sheep or a goat. And what's the process here? There is a bringing out. Well, what did they have to do with Joseph? They had to bring him out of the pit to send him down in Egypt. Now they're being brought out of Egypt in order to be sent back to where they were. So you can almost see this just the whole narrative going, that here is the family of Jacob first finds themselves in Egypt because of Joseph, and then the rest of them come. Well, then they're here. I've used the incubator analogy a number of times, but think of it as a pregnancy, really what it is in a sense, that there's the conception with Joseph and his family. Joseph first coming down into Egypt, then the family following them. Then there's the time of pregnancy they're in there for the 400 some years. And now it's time for the labor, for the birth. And it does take, there's some work that happens here. This is not a just boom, they've been birthed, now they can go back up to Canaan. No, there's a process that takes place here in order for them to, in a sense, be birthed. And it's just incredible to me how everything that the Lord puts into place, it always seems to come back around and make sense. There's so many parallels from beginning to end that we can see here within this text. To me, the things that I've just never noticed before that are far beyond coincidence. I think this seems to clearly be something that the Lord is has put in here, hoping that in a careful reading and study, we see these things and we can really see the beauty of the story. I think that's a beautiful thing that we see here, the connections between what was happening in the conception of the Israelites in Egypt, Joseph coming down, and then here the birth process of them being expelled so they can go back to the land in which they belong.
So it takes 400 years to birth a nation,
Oh,
and 40
no.
weeks to birth a person there.
Yeah, that's right.
Any irony there? I don't know.
I'll let you do it. I'll let Melanie deal with you. You can deal with Melanie with that one, bud. I'll let you have
Seems
that.
like 400 years sometimes.
I plead the fifth. Katie is listening. Katie,
And we came a month early, so
I neither confirm nor deny it. Yeah, well, hold on. Let's see here. Lincoln was supposed to be born like tomorrow or something.
2 days. The 30th
days.
is his due date. So,
and he's been here for 3 weeks, 4 weeks now.
Yeah, going on 4 weeks. So.
Pretty cool, man. That's awesome. That's awesome. Yeah, glad things continue to go really well for you. All right, so let's see here. Where did we finish off, Alan? We talked about the back and forth here. I think we got down to verse 33. Mm-hmm. So we have here what took place, that Pharaoh and his family are attacked. Everybody in Egypt is attacked by God. The firstborn of every family has been struck down. Pharaoh summons Moses and Aaron. Notice during the night, and I want to contrast that with what we see in other places with the plagues. Whenever Pharaoh says, well, tomorrow we'll deal with it. No, there's no tomorrow here. This is an immediate response by Pharaoh. I want you gone now. I want you to take your flocks and your herds, which, think about it as well, there have been a progression there. First, it could be, I believe, the fighting age men can go, and then it was the men and women could go, and he was like, no, you're not going to be able to take your people and your livestock too. Now he's saying, take everything, take the whole nation, your whole group, and I want you guys to go. And of course, also the bless me portion. But verse 33, now the Egyptians pressured the people in order to send them quickly out of the country, for they said, we're all going to die. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, with their kneading bowls wrapped up in their clothes on their shoulders. And the Israelites acted on Moses' word and asked the Egyptians for silver and gold items of clothing, which is what we see a fulfillment of from chapter 3 and verses 21 and 22, and also chapter 11, verses 2 and 3. Verse 36 says, the Lord gave the people such favor with the Egyptians that they gave them what they requested. In this way, they plundered the Egyptians. Notice that the people plundered the Egyptians without ever slinging the first sword, without ever shooting the first arrow from their bow. The Lord here was the instrument. He himself was the instrument of their victory over Egypt. And the Israelites traveled from Ramses to Succoth, about 600,000 able-bodied men on foot, besides their families. A mixed crowd also went up with them, along with the huge number of livestock, both flocks and herds. The people baked the dough they had brought out of Egypt into unleavened loaves, since it had no yeast. For when they were driven out of Egypt, they could not delay and had not prepared provisions for themselves. And the time that the Israelites lived in Egypt was 430 years. And at the end of 430 years, on the same day, all the Lord's military divisions went out from the land of Egypt. That's rehashing what we said earlier. It was a night of vigil in honor of the Lord, because he would bring them out of the land of Egypt. This same night is in honor of the Lord, a night vigil for all the Israelites throughout their generations. Here, Alan, finally is the exit. It's time for them to go. What do you see within this text that is of significance you want to bring up?
Just the sheer number of them. I mean, 600,000 able-bodied men on foot. So I don't even know if that's just men, or is that, just military age men. If it's military age men, then you've got to add in the older men and however many. I mean, and then I added all the women and children to that. So this is a pretty significant group. I mean, we're probably talking in the millions at this point all together. So imagine that large of a group and wandering the wilderness for 40 years and standing before Mount Sinai coming up and passing through the Red Sea in a few more verses. So just a crazy number there. And what else is this? Oh, and then the 430 years, 400 years, just as God had foretold. So all of this is, nothing has come about that wasn't planned. Even the mightiness. It talks about divisions. Like, you don't talk about divisions if it's just a couple thousand people, but the mightiness of the nation, despite the hostility of the Egyptians and Pharaoh for however many years. Yet, we saw already that they were trying to limit and knock down the Israelites. And what did they do? They just multiplied even more. And now we see it. They've got flocks and herds. They've got, thousands and thousands of people. It's a mighty nation at this point. That is God's people.
Right. And just the incredible nature of this exit again, right after following the talking or the description of what's taking place, or notice that he goes back in to talk more about the Passover, verse 43, and talking about the statute of the Passover, about no foreigner should eat it. He speaks about those who would be able to eat it. There was a need for circumcision to be involved, just a number of laws that would apply to them in the observance of this particular festival and memorial. But I want us to note, as you noted, from what we see back in verse 28, that then the Israelites went and did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. Then verse 50, notice the Israelites did this. They did just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron. On the same day, the Lord brought the Israelites out of the land of Egypt according to their military divisions. Just to give somebody something that they might want to go and do some further research on, one of the things Heiser brings up as well about this text, that there is an issue here about these large numbers that you brought up, that it seems incredible to imagine this many people. And he surmises, based upon some research and just the way Hebrew literature worked, that these numbers might not be literal numbers, as far as there are actually 600,000 soldiers. And one of the reasons he thinks that might be the case is just based upon some logistical issues. And in some places, there's just literally not enough space for this number of people. And in part of the pathway that they would have taken, there's so little space for people to squeeze through. It would have been impossible. So he surmises that there might be the way it's structured literally or literally is from this military standpoint, that this is kind of military strength language that would have meant something more to those original readers within the text. Again, that's just something that's you can look into a little more, because if you're speaking about this text with some skeptics, they might have that question. Hold on here. There's no way this could be the case. And if they say that, and if there is some legitimacy to their claim, how could we understand it otherwise? I don't have too much answers for you right now, just because that is a very deep discussion. But for those who are interested, I encourage you to do some digging into that, to maybe see what kind of answer you can come up with for that particular challenge that the skeptic might throw at us.
Go
ahead.
One rebuke of that is looking at the book of Numbers as well.
Mm-hmm.
Numbers chapter 2, it breaks it down by tribe. Mm-hmm. And then I think the number it comes to is 603,550. So 600,000 basically. So you've got that number twice in the scriptures, 2 separate times. So yes, obviously, like I mean, we already read, it was 430 years that they were in Egypt. Well, we always say 400. I mean, is one right and one wrong? No, both of those obviously can be right. One is more precise and one is a rounding. 603,550 is more precise. 600,000 is a rounding. Both are perfectly fine ways of speaking those numbers. So yeah, I mean,
so there's one that you put in your arsenal to talk about if somebody questions you about that. 232.
But
write that down myself.
So that's, I mean, at some point you do have to, obviously there's going to be some faith involved. We don't know exactly what the writer was saying. I mean, there are times when those numbers are more symbolic or have a literary meaning and less of a precise, I'm trying to get the exact number type of meaning. We see that a lot with genealogies. We've talked about that. It's been 14 generations from Abraham to David. Well, clearly it's not just 14 generations, but when you dig deep and you see why they're saying they're trying to come to a round even number, then it makes a little more sense. And it's just, we're trying to read a text from a different culture and a different time through our lens. We're very precise. We want the exact number and we want everything in precise order. Well, that's just not how they did it back then. So you have to be a little bit flexible in how you read certain things. But
because people want to use those generations, and then want to use the generations to basically draw out a timeline. Well, if it's this many generations and people live this long, then it must be this amount of time that this particular thing is talking about. Well, you can't do that. That you're not going to come out accurately, because, as you mentioned, generations just don't line up. Now, does that mean that the Bible is false, that it's inaccurate? No. We have to look at it from the perspective of a Hebrew reading this, and what did they understand about generations? What was the point of the author? So what I'm trying to point out here is that whenever we look at Scripture, what we want to do is we want to look at it very black and white, that it's either this or that. It's either all completely literal, or it's none of it's literal. Everything's symbolic. Well, neither one of those is accurate. We have to look at the text and consider the text, whether something is literal or symbolic. It would be nice. I'll tell you, sure would be great if it was either or. But sometimes it's neither. Sometimes it's something in the middle. And that's what good Bible study does for us. It helps us to really dig in and to examine and not just know what, but know why we believe that something is a particular way. Yeah, great point, Alan. Great point.
It's also good too, just to know, read some of the skeptics or some of the questions like that, because I mean, someone's going to ask that one day, and I've never heard that question before. It's if you've only been reading the Bible, or you've only been reading a certain type of commentary or scholar or something. So it's really, for me, it's kind of fun and very uplifting, and it helps my Bible study when I hear the questions and see both sides. And sometimes it might change my mind a little bit, sometimes it solidifies my faith, but it's good to know the attacks or the different questions, what other people are going to, because not everyone has the same kind of biblical journey that I specifically do. So they might come to a question that I would never even consider. For me, that's not a big deal, but for them, that could be make or break. So, so it's good to expand our study in any ways we can.
Yeah, it's all. I mean, the art of war. It's good to know your enemy. It's good to know those who oppose you. And as we talked about Sunday in our lesson, and the lesson presented about whether or not we should debate and discuss religious things, it's good because it sharpens our knowledge. It might be that somebody has a challenge to us in something regarding our faith, and it might be a legitimate challenge, that it has some legs to it. Well, what does that do? Well, that forces us to re-examine what we believe. And it might be that we're a little off on one particular belief or something else. Then we need to refound our footing and make sure that we are are looking at things the appropriate way. Iron sharpens iron. I believe it's Proverbs 27 and verse 17. It's good for us to do that. It's good for us to read skeptics. Good for us to read their challenges so that we can become more sure or be corrected if correction is needed. All right, Alan, let's get into chapter 13. We're going to look at the first 16 verses of this text quickly and let you have any comments on this, which, again, a lot of this is really a rehashing of what we've already read in chapter 12, beginning in verse 21. But chapter 13 and verse 1, the Lord spoke to Moses, consecrate every firstborn male to me, the firstborn from every womb among Israelites, both man and domestic animal, it is mine. The Lord said to the people, remember this day when you came out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery, for the Lord brought you out of here by the strength of his hand. Nothing leavened may be eaten. Today is the month of Abib. You are going out. So when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, Hittites, Amorites, Hivites, and Jebusites, which he swore to your fathers that he would give you, a land flowing with milk and honey, you must carry out this ceremony in this month. For 7 days you must eat unleavened bread, and on the seventh day there is to be a festival to the Lord. Unleavened bread is to be eaten for those 7 days. Nothing unleavened may be found among you, and no yeast may be found among you in all your territory. On that day, explain to your son. So we go back to chapter 12. In chapter 12, verse 26, when your children ask you, what does this thing mean? Here he says, on that day, explain to your son, this is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt. Let it serve as a sign for you on your hand and as a reminder on your forehead. That reminds me of Deuteronomy chapter 6 and the Shema, so that the Lord's instructions may be in your mouth. For the Lord brought you out of Egypt with a strong hand. Keep this statute at its appointed time from year to year. And when the Lord brings you into the land of the Canaanites, as he swore to you and your fathers, and gives it to you, you are to present to the Lord every firstborn male of the womb. All firstborn offspring of your livestock you own that are males will be the Lord's. You must redeem every firstborn of a donkey with a flock, but if you do not redeem it, break its neck. However, you must redeem every firstborn among your sons. And in the future, when your son asks you, so here's a third time this is kind of brought up, what does this mean? Say to him, by the strength of his hand, the Lord brought us out of Egypt, out of the place of slavery. And when Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord killed every firstborn male in the land of Egypt, both the firstborn of humans and the firstborn of livestock. This is why I sacrifice the Lord all the firstborn of the womb that are males, but I redeem all the firstborn of my sons. So let it be on your hand and a symbol on your forehead. Again, the Shema from Deuteronomy 6, for the Lord has brought us out of Egypt by the strength of his hand. Alan, they say that repetition is a great way to emphasize, and there are a number of repetitive themes even in these short 16 verses. What do you see as standing out here as we close our study for this afternoon?
The key new thing here is going to be just this idea of consecrating the firstborn, and I think it's summed up really good right at the end there in verse 15. You know, this is why, right at the end, the second half of verse 15, this is why I sacrifice to the Lord all the firstborn of the womb that are males, but I redeem all the firstborn of my sons. So the first sentence, why I sacrifice to the Lord, he's talking about the firstborn of their flocks. So they were to, when a donkey gave birth in verse 13, the firstborn was to be sacrificed, and then any after that, they would keep as part of their flock. So they would offer those firstborn of the flocks as sacrifice. That's a pretty good statement of faith to do that, especially if you did not have that many donkeys or flocks or whatever to be willing to offer the firstborn of that flock is placing your trust in God that he will give you more flocks after that.
Yeah, the significance there is that the firstborn, that is your future. Mm-hmm. And if you don't have if you have no other animals or any other children, at least you have that one. And as you say, here you are giving up that one. That is a great statement of faith. I think that's a great point you make there, Alan.
And then why do we do that? Why do they offer the firstborn of the flocks that are males? Well, verse 15 at the end, but to redeem the firstborn of the sons. So they're giving something up. Very important, the firstborn of their flocks, but it's to save their firstborn sons.
Right.
Well, flip that to God and Christ. What does he do? He is willing to give his firstborn son to offer him as that sacrifice to redeem the all of us as the firstborn son. So he sacrifices, his beloved son, so that he can have all of us as firstborn sons as well as adopted sons. So just a pretty powerful reminder. So that's why they were to offer their first, and even the idea of the firstborn son is consecrated to God. So they don't sacrifice their children, but that firstborn is consecrated. Think about Samuel. Hannah prayed for her son. She promised to give him back to the Lord. But what did that mean? She gave him up basically after he was weaned, and he served God away from her in the tabernacle. So in a sense, she did sacrifice him, not literally, but in a sense, she did give him up. And that was supposed to be the idea. The firstborns were supposed to be dedicated to God.
And I think we could see that dedication being a commitment to God based upon what they're to tell that son. You tell them, verse number 8, we do this because of what the Lord did for us. When he asks you, verse 14, you tell them this is because of what the Lord did for us. Again, that's a rehashing of what we've already seen in chapter 12 and verse number 26. When your children ask you, this is to be a not just a memorial for your sake, but it is a teaching tool. It's a tool to build faith in your children towards God.
And imagine, if you will, this concept perfectly fulfilled throughout the nation of Israel. Obviously, it will not be, but imagine everyone's firstborn son being consecrated to God, and their role or their job is to serve God in some way, whether it be in the temple. I think that's because, remember, this comes before all of the priesthood laws and everything. So this is, I think the ideal was that all the firstborns were to be, in a sense, priests of the nation. Later on, we'll see that is narrowed down to just the tribe of Levi. But I think this was the ideal. The first ideal is, all these firstborns were to kind of take that leadership role, that concept of that connection with the priesthood. Really, chapter 12, all of this language, they are the whole nation. The nation as a whole is supposed to be priests in a sense. There's a lot of parallels between chapter 12 and the statutes of the Passover, and chapter 29, which is the actual statutes regarding the consecration of the priest, the Aaron and his sons. There's a whole lot of parallels there, which tells us that, this is what this people was supposed to be. The whole people was the firstborn son. This is my son. God is killing all of the firstborns of Egypt because, in response to this firstborn son of his, being put into slavery. So this whole nation is supposed to be a kingdom of priests, dedicated, consecrated to the service of God. And that's when we extend that parallel to the New Testament. What are we? We are spiritual Israel. We are this nation. So we are, in a sense, priests. We are the ones that can come before God directly. We can pray to him. That veil has been torn. We can speak with him directly in prayer. And that was what was going to happen here, supposed to happen here. But things change a little bit as we go. But that's kind of the interesting that's put in right here at their beginning, at their birth, like you mentioned.
Right. Again, we just cannot overemphasize how many New Testament concepts find their root here within this particular section of the Exodus story. But again, that just shows us that this is a continual story. And just like normal stories that we might read today, there are things that always go back to what's previously happened. You can go back and find your foundation in something from earlier on in the story. And that's what we see here within Exodus, and particularly with the Passover, this 10th plague here that takes place. All right, Alan, do you have anything you want to finish with this afternoon before we wrap up? Anything you want to add?
We'll pick up there, chapter 13 and verse 17
Right.
on Friday, and go through the end of the Song of Moses there in chapter 15. So we'll be able to get through the Red Sea and get to the other side.
That'll work. Sounds like a plan, Alan. Thank you so much for your teaching and sharing with us so much great information. And again, Alan, as always, I hope that those who are still with us, I hope that you appreciate just how much time goes into having to prepare for the large chunks of the text that we're looking at, and how much just discipline takes to narrow down what we're going to share with you in order to keep these even just somewhat decently short, just around an hour or so. Alan, thank you so much. I know you put a lot of time into it to do that with a newborn at the house and doing double the workload that normally you and Melanie split with your teaching online. That means a lot. And I know I appreciate Alan. I hope the audience does as well. But thank you all for joining us today. I hope that you'll be back with us on Friday as we continue through the story of the Exodus, which is the grand story of God, which is the history that is found within the scriptures. Hope you'll join us Friday at 5:00 as we continue to walk through his story. Thank you so much for your participation again. May God bless you and have a great rest of your day. Take care. See you soon.